Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to connect with you for just a moment. Wherever you are in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Are you settling in for the night? Or maybe you're listening during your commute, or perhaps you're on the other side of the world where it's morning. I love hearing from you all. It reminds me that true crime brings us together from every corner of the globe, all fascinated by these mysteries that continue to haunt us. And if you're new here, welcome. If you enjoy detailed, well-researched true crime stories told in a calm, thorough way that helps you drift off to sleep while still engaging your mind, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these deep dive investigations. All right, let's settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're traveling to London, England, in the spring of 1999 to explore one of Britain's most baffling unsolved murders. A case that sparked the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. A case that saw an innocent man spend 8 years in prison, and a case that, 25 years later, still has no answer. This is the story of Jill Dando, Britain's golden girl of television, shot dead on her own doorstep in broad daylight. Close your eyes, and let me take you back to that April morning. Picture England in 1999. Tony Blair is Prime Minister. Princess Diana has been gone less than 2 years, and the nation is still grieving. The internet exists, but most people don't have it at home yet. Mobile phones are chunky Nokia bricks. And on television, one face appears more than almost any other, warm, approachable, professional, and beloved by millions. Her name was Jill Wendy Dando. Jill was born on November 9, 1961, in Weston-super-Mare, a traditional English seaside town in Somerset. Picture candy-colored beach huts, fish and chips wrapped in paper, donkey rides along the sand. That quintessentially British seaside experience. That's where Jill grew up. But Jill's childhood wasn't as carefree as you might imagine. When she was just 3 years old, doctors discovered something serious. She had a hole in her heart and a blocked pulmonary artery. In 1965, at age 4, little Jill underwent open-heart surgery to correct these life-threatening conditions. It was a terrifying time for her family, but Jill pulled through. She was a fighter from the very beginning. Jill had an older brother named Nigel, and they were raised by parents Jack and Jean Dando in a loving, stable home. Jill's mother Jean was a woman of faith, and she raised Jill with strong Christian values. That faith would stay with Jill throughout her life. As a teenager, Jill knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life: broadcasting and journalism. She set her sights on that goal with determination. After finishing school, she got her first job at the local newspaper, the Weston Mercury, as a trainee reporter. For 5 years, she learned her craft there, covering local events, writing articles, developing her skills. But Jill had ambitions beyond print journalism. In 1985, at age 24, she made the leap to broadcasting when she landed a position with BBC Radio Devon as a newsreader. It was her foot in the door at the BBC, an institution that would define her career and, ultimately, her legacy. From radio, Jill moved to regional television, working on BBC's Spotlight program in Plymouth. And it was there that producers began to notice something special about her. Jill had that rare quality that can't be taught. She was a natural on camera. She was warm without being saccharine, professional without being cold, authoritative without being intimidating. Viewers felt like they knew her personally, like she was a friend sitting in their living room delivering the news. By the late 1980s, Jill had moved from regional broadcasting to national television in London. She started appearing on BBC Breakfast, co-hosting the early morning program and becoming a familiar face to millions of Britons starting their day. Then came the 6 o'clock news, one of the BBC's flagship programs, where Jill became a trusted news anchor delivering the day's most important stories. But Jill wasn't just a newsreader. She had range. She hosted Holiday, a popular travel program that ran for years on BBC One, taking viewers to exotic destinations and holiday spots around the world. She presented Songs of Praise, a long-running religious program that combined hymns with human interest stories. perfect for someone with Jill's faith background. She even hosted a show called Antiques Inspectors, which would ultimately become poignant as the final series she recorded. And then there was Crime Watch. Crime Watch was, and still is, one of British television's most watched programs. It's a crime appeal show where police present details of unsolved crimes, show CCTV footage, conduct reconstructions, and ask the public for information. It had led to the solving of countless cases over the years. Jill co-presented Crime Watch alongside veteran broadcaster Nick Ross, and it became one of her most high-profile roles. By 1997, Jill Dando had reached the pinnacle of her profession. The BBC named her their Personality of the Year, an incredible honor. She was regularly referred to in the press as the Golden Girl of British television, and even TV's Diana, because of her warmth, her public appeal, and the way she seemed to represent something fundamentally decent and trustworthy about Britain. In her personal life, things were finally falling into place as well. Jill had been in a long-term relationship with BBC executive Bob Wheaton from 1989 to 1996, but that had ended. She'd briefly dated a national park warden named Simon Basil. And then, in December 1997, Jill was set up on a blind date by a mutual friend. The man she met was Dr. Alan Farthing, a gynecologist and obstetrician. Alan was separated from his wife at the time, going through a divorce. But there was an instant connection between him and Jill. After Alan's divorce was finalized, the relationship became more serious. On January 31st, 1999, Jill and Alan announced their engagement. They set a wedding date, September 25th, 1999. Jill was 37 years old. She was at the peak of her career. She was engaged to a man she loved. The future looked bright and full of possibility. She had no idea she had less than 3 months to live. Monday, April 26, 1999. Let me paint you a picture of that morning, that ordinary morning that would end in tragedy. Jill owned a house at 29 Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London. It was a Victorian terraced house, nothing flashy, just a comfortable home in a nice residential neighborhood. The street was tree-lined and quiet, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and felt safe. But by April 1999, Jill wasn't actually living in that house full-time anymore. She was in the process of selling it. Why? Because she'd been spending most of her time at her fiancé Alan Farthing's house in nearby Chiswick. They were building a life together, preparing for their wedding, and it made sense to consolidate. But Jill still owned the Gowan Avenue property and visited it occasionally to check on things, collect mail, that sort of routine maintenance. The night of April 25th, Sunday night, Jill stayed at Alan's house in Chiswick, as she usually did. They spent a quiet evening together. Alan was a busy doctor, and Jill had work commitments coming up. She was scheduled to present the 6 o'clock news on Tuesday, the following day. She was also booked to co-host the British Academy Television Awards, the BAFTAs, on May 9th, alongside legendary broadcaster Michael Parkinson. And of course, there was the wedding to plan for September. Life was full and busy and good. On the morning of Monday, April 26th, Jill woke up, got dressed, and told Alan she needed to pop over to her Gowan Avenue house to take care of some things. It was a routine errand. She'd done it many times before. Alan was working that day, so Jill would go alone. She left Alan's house around mid-morning and drove her BMW convertible through the streets of West London, from Chiswick to Fulham, a distance of just a few miles. Traffic cameras would later confirm her movements. She arrived at 29 Gowan Avenue around 11:30 a.m. Now, let me describe what happened next as best as investigators have been able to piece it together. Jill parked her car on the street. She gathered her things, her handbag, her car keys. She walked up to her front door. It was a bright spring day. The street was quiet but not deserted. This was late morning in a residential area of London. People were home, going about their business, maybe working from home or running errands. Jill approached her front door. She had her keys in her hand, ready to unlock it. And that's when someone attacked her. The attacker came from behind or perhaps from the side, we don't know for certain. What we do know is this. The attacker grabbed Jill, forced her down toward the ground, pressed a gun directly against her head and fired a single shot. It was a 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol. The gun was pressed so tightly against Jill's head that it acted almost like a silencer, muffling the sound of the gunshot. That's why, despite it being late morning in a residential area, remarkably few people heard anything unusual. One neighbor, a man named Richard Hughes, later told police that he heard Jill scream. Just once, a short scream, but he didn't hear a gunshot. He thought perhaps she'd seen a spider or been startled by something. He didn't investigate. He had no reason to think anything serious had happened. The bullet entered Jill's head just above her left ear. It was a contact wound, meaning the gun was pressed directly against her skin when it fired. This is significant. Professional assassins often use this technique because it ensures the shot is fatal and reduces noise. But it also requires getting very close to your victim, being physically right there, which increases the risk of being seen or caught. Jill Dando died almost instantly. The shot was immediately fatal. There would have been no suffering, no prolonged agony, just life and then nothing. The attacker fled. They left the single spent cartridge case on the ground. It was found later by forensics. They took the gun with them. They vanished into the London streets, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared. Jill's body lay on her doorstep. Her keys were still clutched in her hand. Her handbag was nearby, untouched. Nothing had been stolen. No one had ransacked her house. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was an execution. At 11:47 a.m., just 15 minutes after Jill was shot, a neighbor found her. They immediately called 999. Emergency services rushed to the scene. Jill was taken to Charing Cross Hospital, but it was already too late. She was pronounced dead on arrival at 1:03 p.m. By early afternoon, the news was spreading. BBC colleagues were being informed. Alan Farthing was being told that his fiancée had been murdered. Jill's family in Weston-super-Mare was receiving the worst phone call of their lives. And across Britain, as the news broke on television and radio, an entire nation went into shock. Jill Dando, beloved broadcaster, the face of the BBC, someone millions invited into their homes every day, had been murdered in broad daylight on her own doorstep. The initial reports were confused. Some BBC colleagues thought she'd been stabbed because there was so much blood at the scene. But soon the truth emerged. She'd been shot, a single bullet to the head. Quick, efficient, deadly. Prime Minister Tony Blair released a statement expressing his shock and sadness. Queen Elizabeth II sent condolences. The public reaction was compared to the outpouring of grief that followed Princess Diana's death less than 2 years earlier. And the Metropolitan Police launched what would become one of the largest criminal investigations in British history. The investigation was given a name, Operation Oxborough. And from the very beginning, it was massive in scale. Over the course of the investigation, police would interview more than 2,500 people. They would take over 1,000 witness statements. They would trace approximately 1,200 cars that had been in the Fulham area that morning. They would follow up on thousands and thousands of tips from the public. But despite this enormous effort, they had remarkably little to work with. The crime scene itself yielded limited evidence. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong there. No DNA was recovered from the attacker. This was before DNA analysis was as sophisticated as it is today, and the attacker apparently didn't leave any biological material behind. The only physical evidence from the attacker was that single-spent 9mm cartridge case. Ballistics experts examined the cartridge and the bullet recovered from Jill's head. They determined the weapon was likely a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, possibly modified or adapted in some way. But they couldn't identify the specific weapon, and it was never recovered. Witnesses were surprisingly limited, given that this was mid-morning in a residential area. A few people reported seeing a man in the vicinity of Gowan Avenue around the time of the murder, but descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory. One witness described a man who was tall and slim, well-dressed, possibly in his late 30s or early 40s. Another witness saw someone who might have been the same man but gave slightly different details. Crucially, CCTV cameras captured footage of a man at Putney Bridge tube station, about a mile away from the crime scene, approximately 20 minutes after the murder. This man, referred to in the investigation as Man X, was never identified. He was wearing a suit and tie, appeared calm and unhurried, and simply vanished into the London transport system. Was he the killer, or just a random commuter? To this day, nobody knows. From the beginning, police and the media speculated about motive. Why would someone want to kill Jill Dando? She was a television presenter, not a politician or a criminal or someone you'd expect to have dangerous enemies. Several theories emerged almost immediately. The most obvious theory was that someone connected to Crime Watch wanted revenge. Perhaps a criminal who'd been featured on the show, or someone who blamed Jill for their arrest or conviction. After all, Crime Watch had been instrumental in solving hundreds of crimes over the years. Maybe someone held a grudge. Police examined every single Crime Watch case that Jill had been involved with. They interviewed dozens of convicted criminals, known hitmen, and people with connections to organized crime. They found nothing. No credible threats. No evidence that anyone from Crime Watch had targeted her. Senior investigating officer Hamish Campbell later said, "How would it be served by somebody on Crime Watch, some villain or criminal going, 'I know what, I'm so upset with this, I'm going to kill Jill Dando'? That made no sense at all." And he had a point. If you were a criminal angry about Crime Watch, wouldn't you target the police officers who arrested you, or the informant who turned you in, rather than the presenter who simply read the story on television? It seemed illogical. This theory gained traction quickly and has remained one of the most discussed possibilities. In early 1999, the UK and NATO were engaged in the Kosovo War, opposing Serbia. On April 23, 1999, just 3 days before Jill was murdered, NATO warplanes bombed the Radio Television Serbia headquarters in Belgrade, killing 16 people who were working there. Just 3 weeks before her death, on April 5th, Jill had presented a BBC appeal for aid for Kosovan Albanian refugees who were fleeing ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. That appeal raised over £1 million. It was shown repeatedly on television in the weeks leading up to her murder. The theory goes like this. Serb hardliners saw Jill's appeal as propaganda against Serbia. They decided to retaliate for the NATO bombing by killing a prominent British television personality. The murder was meant to send a message. You bomb our media, we kill yours. Within hours of Jill's murder, multiple phone calls were made to the BBC and other media outlets from people claiming to represent Serb groups taking responsibility for the killing. One caller with an Eastern European accent said, "Your Prime Minister Blair butchered innocent young people, we butcher back." But these calls were never verified and were largely dismissed as hoaxes. Opportunists taking advantage of a tragedy to spread fear or get attention. However, there were some compelling details that kept this theory alive. Just a few days before Jill's murder, on April 11th, an opposition journalist in Belgrade named Slavko Kurovića was assassinated outside his home. The method was strikingly similar, a single shot to the head in broad daylight. His widow, Branka Prpa, later said she believed there was a connection between her husband's murder and Jill's. At Barry George's first trial in 2001, his defense barrister Michael Mansfield QC proposed that Serbian warlord Arkan, a notorious figure responsible for war crimes, had ordered Jill's assassination in retaliation for NATO actions. Mansfield suggested that professional Serbian assassins could have carried out the hit. This theory has gained renewed attention in recent years. In 2024, a Daily Mirror investigation identified a potential suspect. Milorad Julmek, a twice-convicted Serbian hitman and gang leader currently serving 40 years in a Serbian prison. A facial comparison expert found striking similarities between Julmek and Man X from the Putney Bridge CCTV footage. Julmek had been summoned by Serbian security services in March 1999, just 1 month before Jill's murder, and tasked with removing someone who is currently threatening the security of the state. The Metropolitan Police confirmed they are examining this new line of inquiry, but no charges have been filed. This theory suggested that Jill had been targeted by someone obsessed with her, a stalker or a fan whose admiration had turned deadly. The seemingly opportunistic nature of the attack The fact that the killer knew where she lived and apparently waited for her fit this profile. Jill was a beautiful, famous television personality. She received fan mail regularly. But there was no evidence of any threatening letters or concerning behavior from any particular fan. Her agent later mentioned that after the Kosovo appeal, they had received some mail that seemed somewhat threatening, but nothing concrete enough to report to police or take seriously. Police looked into this angle extensively but found no credible suspect. This theory never gained much traction because nothing was stolen. Jill's handbag was right there. Her car keys were in her hand. If someone wanted to rob her, why not take anything? Why kill her and then flee empty-handed? Some suggested perhaps the attacker had intended to rob her, but she screamed or fought back. So they shot her in a panic and ran. But this doesn't explain the professional execution-style nature of the killing. Gun pressed to the head, single shot, escape, or why the attacker brought a gun to what would be a simple mugging. By late 1999 and into 2000, the investigation was stalling. Despite the enormous effort, despite the thousands of leads, police had no clear suspect. The case was going cold. And then a name emerged that would dominate the case for the next decade: Barry George. Let me introduce you to Barry Michael George, born April 15, 1960. To understand how he became the prime suspect in Jill Dando's murder, and eventually the only person ever convicted of it, you need to understand who Barry George was. Barry grew up in West London and attended a school for children with educational and behavioral difficulties. He left at age 16 without any qualifications. Throughout his life, he struggled with what would later be diagnosed as various learning disabilities and mental health issues. Some reports mention epilepsy. His home life was unstable. As a young man, Barry developed some troubling patterns of behavior. He had a history of impersonating police officers and authority figures. He'd dress up in uniforms or official-looking clothing and authority figures. He'd dress up in uniforms or official-looking clothing and adopt false identities. Sometimes posing as a rock musician, he'd used the names of various famous musicians over the years. More seriously, Barry had convictions for sex offenses. In June 1981, he was convicted of indecent assault against a woman and received a 3-month suspended prison sentence. In March 1983, he was convicted of attempted rape of a woman in Acton, West London, and served 18 months of a 33-month sentence. By the 1990s, Barry was living in a flat in Queen's Park, Fulham, less than a mile from Jill Dando's house on Gowan Avenue. He was unemployed, living alone, known to neighbors as odd and somewhat reclusive. He called himself Barry Bulsara at various times, Bulsara being Freddie Mercury's real surname, and had an obsession with Freddie Mercury and Queen. When police began investigating Jill's murder, they compiled a massive list of potential suspects. Anyone in the area with a criminal record, anyone known to have mental health issues, anyone who might fit a profile. Barry George's name came up because of his proximity to the crime scene and his previous convictions. In April 2000, about a year after the murder, police obtained a warrant to search Barry's flat. What they found was disturbing but not necessarily incriminating. They found thousands of photographs, literally thousands, of women taken without their knowledge on the streets of London. Just candid photos of random women going about their business. It was creepy but not illegal. They found magazines about firearms, martial arts, and military equipment. They found news clippings about Jill Dando's murder, but given how massive the media coverage was, lots of people probably had clippings. They found a photograph of Barry himself wearing a gas mask and holding what appeared to be a gun. This looked suspicious, but the gun turned out to be a replica or a starting pistol, not a real firearm. And they found a coat, a Cecil G. brand coat hanging in his kitchen. This coat would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Police seized the coat and sent it for forensic examination. And in the internal right pocket of that coat, forensic scientist Robin Keeley discovered something, a single microscopic particle. It was 11.5 microns. That's about 1/100th of a millimeter. To give you a sense of scale, a human hair is about 70 microns wide. This particle was smaller than that. But this wasn't just any particle. It was firearms discharge residue, specifically percussion primer cap residue. It contained barium, aluminum, and lead in proportions consistent with the type of ammunition used to kill Jill Dando. For police, this was the smoking gun. Literally. A particle of gunshot residue in Barry George's coat pocket that matched the ammunition from the murder. On May 25, 2000, Barry George was arrested and charged with the murder of Jill Dando. The case against him seemed strong on the surface. He lived less than a mile from Jill's house. He had previous convictions, including sexual offenses. He had an obsession with celebrities and collected photos of women. He owned military and firearm-related magazines. He was seen by witnesses in the area around the time of the murder. Most importantly, there was that particle of gunshot residue in his coat pocket. When questioned by police, Barry George's behavior seemed suspicious. He lied about various things, where he'd been, what he'd been doing. He created what police believed was a false alibi. He showed no emotion when told he was being arrested for murder. The trial began in early 2001 at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London, where the most serious criminal cases are tried. The prosecution's case relied heavily on 4 categories of evidence. First, identification evidence. One witness identified Barry George as being in Jill Dando Street 4.5 hours before the murder. Other witnesses saw a man in the street in the 2 hours before the murder who might have been George, though they couldn't pick him out of a lineup with certainty. Second, his interviews with police, which the prosecution characterized as full of lies, particularly about his knowledge of and interest in Jill Dando. Third, his apparent attempts to create a false alibi for the time of the shooting. Fourth, and most crucially, that single particle of gunshot residue. The prosecution's forensic expert, Robin Keeley, testified that, in his opinion, finding this particle in George's pocket a year after the murder was significant. He said it was more likely that the particle came from Barry George firing a gun than from some innocent source of contamination. The defense argued strenuously against this. They brought in their own expert, Dr. Robin Asbury Lloyd, who testified that a single microscopic particle found a year after the alleged event could easily have come from innocent contamination. The particle was so small that to rely on it was, in his words, incredible. The defense also argued that Barry George, who had learning disabilities and mental health issues, was simply not capable of planning and executing such a precise professional murder. A neuropsychiatrist named Michael Kopelman testified that George's mental state made him incapable of the calculating behavior required to commit this crime. But after deliberating for almost 32 hours, the jury returned a verdict, guilty, by a majority of 10-1. On July 2, 2001, Barry George was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Jill Dando. The public breathed a sigh of relief. Jill's family had some sense of closure. The BBC could memorialize her without the shadow of an unsolved murder hanging over everything. Justice, it seemed, had been served, but doubts remained. That 10-1 verdict meant one juror didn't believe the evidence. The case had been entirely circumstantial except for that single particle. And even at the time, some legal observers thought the conviction was unsafe. They were right to be concerned. Barry George immediately appealed his conviction. In 2002, the Court of Appeal heard his case but dismissed the appeal, upholding the jury's verdict. The judges concluded that the evidence had been properly presented and it was up to the jury to decide. George's conviction stood. Barry George went to prison believing he was innocent. He maintained from the beginning that he had nothing to do with Jill Dando's murder. And crucially, he had supporters who believed him. In November 2002, George's family submitted an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC, an independent body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice in England and Wales. They argued that Barry George's conviction was unsafe and should be reviewed. The CCRC launched a thorough investigation, and what they found would change everything. They consulted with new forensic experts about that crucial particle of gunshot residue. And these experts told them something that contradicted what had been said at trial. By the mid-2000s, forensic science regarding gunshot residue was evolving. The Forensic Science Service itself was going through a period of reassessment. They were discovering that single particles of gunshot residue could come from many sources beyond someone actually firing a gun. You see, gunshot residue particles are incredibly small and can be transferred easily. They can come from someone who recently handled a firearm. They can come from contamination at a firing range. They can come from touching something or someone that has been in contact with firearms. Police officers who carry guns can transfer particles. Even fireworks contain similar particles. And crucially, particles can transfer during evidence handling, from one item to another if they're not handled with extreme care. The new expert analysis concluded something shocking. Finding a single microscopic particle in a coat pocket 1 year after an alleged crime was essentially meaningless as evidence. It was just as likely that the particle came from innocent contamination as from Barry George firing the murder weapon. In other words, the particle had no real evidentiary value at all. One forensic scientist interviewed for a 2019 BBC documentary stated that potentially 1 in 100 people could have gunshot residue on their clothing, picked up unknowingly from environmental sources. This was devastating for the prosecution's case because that particle had been the only hard forensic evidence linking Barry George to the crime. Everything else was circumstantial. Being in the area, which was where he lived, having an interest in the news, like millions of people, lying in police interviews, which many innocent people do when they're frightened. But here's something even more troubling. It turned out that 2 senior scientists at the Forensic Science Service had met secretly just months after the trial and had discussed these very concerns about the gunshot residue evidence. They had agreed between themselves that the particle was likely meaningless. But neither of them told the prosecution, the defense, or the court. This crucial information was kept secret for years. On May 19, 2007, the CCRC decided to refer Barry George's conviction back to the Court of Appeal, citing this new evidence about the gunshot residue. The Court of Appeal heard the case again in November 2007. On November 15, 2007, they announced their decision. The appeal was allowed and the conviction was quashed. The court ruled that if the jury at the original trial had heard the truth about the gunshot residue, that a single particle was essentially meaningless as evidence, there was no certainty they would have found George guilty. The conviction was unsafe. Barry George was released from prison after serving 8 years for a crime he may not have committed. But the Crown Prosecution Service wasn't ready to let it go. They decided to retry him. A second trial began in 2008, and this time, with the gunshot residue evidence discredited, the case against Barry George looked much weaker. The retrial jury heard all the circumstantial evidence again. The witnesses who maybe saw him near the crime scene, his odd behavior, his lies to police. But without the forensic evidence, it wasn't enough. On August 1, 2008, a jury unanimously acquitted Barry George of Jill Dando's murder. He walked out of the Old Bailey a free man. The acquittal of Barry George left everyone back at square one. If Barry George didn't kill Jill Dando, then who did? Barry George later sought compensation for wrongful imprisonment. He'd spent 8 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, but his claim was denied. The courts ruled that while his conviction had been overturned because it was unsafe, that didn't mean the original trial was unfair or that he'd been wrongfully convicted in the legal sense. He'd had a reasonable trial based on the evidence available at the time. The bar for compensation is extremely high in the UK, and George didn't meet it. This decision was controversial. Many people felt that if someone is acquitted, especially after new evidence proves the original conviction was based on flawed science, they should be compensated for their lost years. But the law doesn't work that way in Britain. For Jill's family and friends, the acquittal was devastating in a different way. They'd believed for 8 years that her killer was in prison. They'd had some sense of closure, some sense that justice had been served. Now that was taken away. The case was unsolved again. Somewhere out there, the real killer was walking free. Nick Ross, Jill's Crime Watch co-presenter, has said publicly that he still believes Barry George was guilty despite the acquittal. He's written extensively about the case, arguing that the circumstantial evidence was stronger than people give it credit for. But he's in the minority. Most people involved in the case now accept that Barry George was wrongly convicted. So if not Barry George, then who? Let's revisit the theories with fresh eyes. As I mentioned earlier, this theory has gained new life in recent years thanks to that Daily Mirror investigation into Milorad Yulmek. Here's what makes this theory compelling. Yulmek was a professional assassin. He'd killed before and would kill again. He was convicted of assassinating Serbian Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić in 2003, and he's also convicted of the murder of opposition journalist Slavko Ćuruvija in 1999, just weeks before Jill's death, using a remarkably similar method. In March 1999, 1 month before Jill's murder, Yulmek was summoned by the head of Serbian security services and tasked with removing someone threatening the security of the state. The CCTV footage from Putney Bridge shows Man X, wearing a tie that appears identical to one Yulmek was photographed wearing. Facial comparison analysis shows similarities between Yulmek and Man X. The timing of Jill's murder, just days after NATO bombed Serbian television, fits the revenge narrative. Multiple phone calls to the BBC claiming Serb responsibility, even if dismissed as hoaxes, might have been genuine. The professional nature of the killing, single-shot, close-range escape fits with a trained assassin, not a local stalker or opportunistic killer. But there are problems with this theory too. Why would Serbia risk international condemnation by killing a British television presenter? The political fallout would be enormous. Serbia was already an international pariah at that point. Would they really make it worse? If Serbian intelligence was behind it, wouldn't they have done a better job of making it look like an accident or a random crime? Why use a method so obviously an assassination? Yulmek has never been questioned about Jill's murder. He's in a Serbian prison serving 40 years, but Serbian authorities haven't cooperated with British police on this matter. Without Serbia's cooperation, this lead likely goes nowhere. Some investigators believe Jill was killed by a professional hitman, but not necessarily a Serbian one. The execution-style nature of the killing suggests someone with training and experience. The modified 9mm semi-automatic pistol suggests access to illegal weapons and the knowledge to modify them to make them less traceable. The fact that the killer escaped without leaving significant evidence suggests planning and professionalism. But again, we return to the question, who would hire a hitman to kill Jill Dando and why? She wasn't involved in organized crime. She wasn't an investigative journalist exposing dangerous secrets. She was a television presenter. Who would pay for her death? Perhaps Barry George was on the right track as a suspect, just the wrong person. Maybe someone else was stalking or obsessed with Jill, someone who police never identified. Jill was beautiful, famous, and very much in the public eye. She received fan mail. She was recognizable everywhere she went. It's entirely possible someone developed an unhealthy obsession. The timing, killing her just months before her wedding, could fit with an obsessed fan who couldn't bear to see her marry someone else. The location, her own doorstep, suggests someone who knew where she lived and had perhaps been watching her, waiting for an opportunity. But again, there's no evidence of any specific stalker. No threatening letters were kept. No one came forward with reports of concerning behavior from any particular individual. This is one of the more controversial theories, but it has been suggested. What if Jill wasn't the intended target at all? What if the killer mistook her for someone else? Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, was a prominent gynecologist. Some have speculated that perhaps he was the real target, maybe an anti-abortion extremist or a patient with a grudge, and Jill was killed by mistake. But this theory doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. The killer approached Jill from behind or the side. It's hard to imagine they didn't see her face at some point. Plus, Jill was famous, very recognizable. It would be difficult to mistake her for someone else. This is perhaps the most disturbing possibility, that Jill Dando was killed for no particular reason at all, by someone who selected her randomly or opportunistically. Maybe someone saw her arrive at her house, followed her to the door, and killed her as part of some psychotic break or delusional episode. Maybe it was someone practicing or testing their ability to kill, using Jill as a practice target before moving on to their real intended victims. Victims we never knew about because they were never attacked. Serial killers often start somewhere. What if Jill's murder was someone's first kill, and they got scared by the massive investigation and never killed again. This theory is unsatisfying because it provides no closure, no motive, no explanation. But randomness is sometimes the hardest truth to accept. Not everything has meaning. Sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. In the years since Jill's murder, her memory has been honored in various ways. The British Academy Television Awards, where Jill was supposed to co-present just days after her murder, established the Jill Dando Award. It's given annually to someone who has made a significant contribution to broadcasting. Recipients have included Michael Parkinson, Tony Blackburn, and many others. A memorial fund was established in her name, supporting various charitable causes Jill cared about during her life. In Weston-super-Mare, where Jill grew up, there are memorials to her. The local community has never forgotten their famous daughter. The BBC has produced several documentaries about her case over the years, including a major one in 2019 for the 20th anniversary of her death, and most recently in 2023, Who Killed Jill Dando?, which explored the Serbian connection theory in depth. Netflix released a 3-part documentary series about the case in September 2023, bringing international attention to this very British mystery. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, eventually moved on with his life. He married in 2008, 9 years after Jill's death, and has continued his medical career. In fact, he went on to become surgeon gynecologist to the royal household, treating members of the British royal family. He was part of the medical team for the Duchess of Cambridge's, now Princess of Wales, pregnancies. He has rarely spoken publicly about Jill, maintaining his privacy and dignity through the years. Nick Ross, Jill's Crime Watch co-presenter, has been more vocal. He's written books that discuss the case, given numerous interviews, and continued to maintain that he believes Barry George was guilty despite the acquittal. His view is controversial, but he stands by it. Jill's brother Nigel has been the public face of the family, speaking occasionally about the case, advocating for continued investigation, and keeping Jill's memory alive. The pain of losing his sister in such a brutal way, and never knowing who did it or why, is something he carries every day. In 2019, on the 20th anniversary of the murder, Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton was put in charge of reviewing the case. He announced that they were looking at the Serbian connection more seriously than ever before, particularly in light of the Milorad Yulmek evidence. But as of December 2025, more than 26 years after Jill's murder, no one has been charged. The case remains officially unsolved. The Metropolitan Police maintain that the investigation is still open. They say they regularly review the case when new information comes to light. But realistically, unless someone comes forward with new evidence or a confession, or unless forensic technology advances to the point where previously tested evidence can yield new results, it's hard to see how the case will ever be solved. Many of the key witnesses are now elderly or have passed away. Physical evidence has degraded. Memories have faded. Time is not on the side of justice in this case. So what really happened to Jill Dando on that sunny April morning in 1999? Was she killed by Serbian assassins in retaliation for NATO's bombing campaign? Was she targeted by a stalker whose obsession turned deadly? Was it a professional hit ordered by someone for reasons we can't even imagine? Or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of random violence that defies explanation? We may never know. What we do know is this: Jill Dando was a talented broadcaster, a kind person by all accounts, someone who brought information and entertainment into millions of homes. She supported charities, she helped refugees. She presented crime appeals that solved cases and brought closure to families. She was engaged to be married. She was planning a future with someone she loved. She had years of career success ahead of her. She had family who adored her and colleagues who respected her. And on April 26, 1999, someone took all of that away in a single moment with a single bullet. Her murder shocked Britain in a way few crimes have before or since. It shattered the sense of safety people felt even in their own homes, in their own neighborhoods, in broad daylight. If someone as famous and beloved as Jill Dando could be murdered on her own doorstep in the middle of the morning, then anyone could be. The failure to solve the case, the wrongful conviction of Barry George, the years of his life lost, The acquittal that left the real killer free represents one of the biggest failures in modern British criminal justice. 26 years later, someone out there knows what happened. Whether it's the killer themselves, now elderly or perhaps already dead, or someone who heard something, saw something, knows something, someone has the answer. If you're listening to this and you're in Britain, and you have any information about Jill Dando's murder, please contact the Metropolitan Police. Even after all these years, even if you think what you know is insignificant, it could be the piece that finally solves this puzzle. Jill Dando deserves justice. Her family deserves closure. And Britain deserves to know the truth about what happened to one of its most beloved broadcasters. Until that day comes, her case remains one of the most baffling unsolved murders in British history. A mystery that continues to haunt a nation. Rest in peace, Jill Dando. We haven't forgotten you. Now, close your eyes. Let these thoughts settle gently in your mind and drift peacefully to sleep. Tomorrow is a new day, and somewhere, perhaps, someone will finally come forward with the truth. Story 2. Settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you to a cold March morning in 2009, to the historic city of York in northern England. Picture cobblestone streets, ancient walls that have stood for centuries, the magnificent York Minster Cathedral rising against gray skies. It's a city where Romans once walked, where Vikings ruled, where medieval kings held court. A city steeped in history, tradition, and usually safety. But on March 19, 2009, something happened in York that would shake this ancient city to its core. A young woman named Claudia Lawrence left her home to walk to work at the University of York, just as she had done countless times before. She never arrived. She was never seen again. And despite one of the largest missing person investigations in British history, despite 9 arrests, despite searches of lakes and woodlands and houses, despite advances in forensic technology and countless appeals, 16 years later, no one knows what happened to her. Tonight, I'm going to take you through every detail of this baffling case. We'll walk through Claudia's last known hours, examine the evidence that's been gathered, explore the theories that have emerged, and try to understand how someone can simply vanish in broad daylight in a modern British city, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. This is the story of Claudia Lawrence, a case that remains unsolved, a mystery that haunts York, and a daughter who never came home. Before we talk about her disappearance, let me tell you about Claudia Elizabeth Lawrence. Not as a victim, not as a case number, but as the vibrant person she was. Claudia was born on February 27, 1974, in Malton, North Yorkshire. Her father, Peter Lawrence, was a well-respected solicitor, a lawyer specializing in conveyancing and property law. Her mother, Joan, was active in local politics and would eventually become the mayor of Malton. They raised Claudia in the Heworth area of York, giving her a stable, middle-class upbringing filled with love and support. Claudia had one sister, Alexandra, who was younger. The sisters were close, but Claudia was the outgoing one, the social butterfly, the one who loved being surrounded by friends and laughter. As she grew up, Claudia developed a passion for cooking. She trained as a chef and found her calling in professional kitchens. By her mid-30s, she'd settled into a position she loved, working as a chef at the Roger Kirk Center at Goodricke College, part of the University of York. It was steady, reliable work. She worked early morning shifts, arriving before dawn to prepare breakfast for students. The hours were unsociable. She often started at 6 a.m., but Claudia didn't mind. She was good at her job, well-liked by her colleagues, and she enjoyed the rhythm of kitchen work. Claudia lived alone at 29 Heworth Road, a Victorian terraced house in a quiet residential area of York. The house was her sanctuary, cozy, decorated to her taste, a place where she felt safe and comfortable. The walk from her house to the university was about 3 miles, and when her car was working, she'd drive. But in early March 2009, her car, a blue Vauxhall Corsa, had gone into the garage for repairs, so she'd been walking to work instead. Friends described Claudia as outgoing, sociable, someone who loved going out for drinks, meeting friends, enjoying life. She was attractive, slim build, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was fashionable, taking care of her appearance. She was 35 years old and, by all accounts, happy with her life. But Claudia's personal life was complicated, though in ways that seemed perfectly normal at the time. She'd had relationships, some more serious than others. She'd been on dating websites. She socialized in York's pubs and bars. Later, much later, police would describe some of her relationships as having an element of complexity and mystery to them, a phrase that sparked endless speculation in the media and led to some unfair characterizations of Claudia's private life. Her father Peter would later defend his daughter against the scrutiny, saying, "The nature of the lifestyle, if we can call it a lifestyle, as far as I am concerned, is Claudia living her life as a single 35-year-old woman in the 21st century." And he was right. Claudia was a single woman living her life. She had friendships, relationships, a job she enjoyed, a home she loved, and parents who adored her. There was nothing unusual or suspicious about her life. She was just living the way millions of people do every day. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Claudia had been looking forward to things. Mother's Day was approaching on March 22nd, just days away, and she was planning to visit her mother. She'd made dinner plans with friends. She was thinking about taking a holiday to Cyprus, where she'd visited several times before and had made friends. Life was good. Life was normal. And then, in less than 24 hours, Claudia Lawrence ceased to exist in the world her family and friends knew. Wednesday, March 18th, 2009. Let me walk you through Claudia's last known day, hour by hour, because somewhere in these details might lie the answer to what happened to her. Claudia's alarm went off early that morning. She had an early shift at the university. She arrived at Goodrich College around 6 a.m. and began her work in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for students. It was routine work, familiar work. Her colleagues later said she seemed completely normal, cheerful, chatty, in good spirits. There was nothing to suggest anything was wrong or that she was worried about anything. Her shift ended at 2 p.m. in the early afternoon. Claudia gathered her things, her rucksack that she used to carry her chef's whites and personal items, her mobile phone, her keys. She left the university and began the long walk home. Now, this walk was about 3 miles, which would take roughly an hour on foot. It was March, so it was cold but not freezing. The route took her through residential areas of York, along roads that were familiar to her after weeks of making this journey while her car was in the shop. As Claudia walked along Melrose Gate, a main road about halfway home, a friend happened to drive past and recognized her. This friend pulled over and offered Claudia a lift the rest of the way home. Claudia gratefully accepted. This was the last confirmed sighting of Claudia Lawrence by someone who knew her. She was dropped off at her house at 29 Haworth Road at approximately 3 to 3:05 p.m. CCTV cameras captured her walking toward her house. She was wearing her chef's uniform and carrying her rucksack. She looked perfectly normal, just a woman coming home from work. Once home, Claudia likely did what most people do after a work shift. She changed out of her uniform, relaxed for a bit, had something to eat or drink. Her house was her refuge after a long morning shift starting before dawn. At approximately 8 p.m. that evening, Claudia spoke on the phone with her mother, Joan. They had a pleasant conversation about normal, everyday things. Joan would later say that Claudia sounded normal and relaxed. They discussed plans for Mother's Day that Sunday. Claudia mentioned she was going to have an early night because she had another early shift the next morning. She needed to be at work by 6 a.m. again, which meant leaving her house around 5 o'clock or 5:15 a.m. in the dark. Claudia also spoke to her father Peter that evening. Again, nothing seemed amiss. She was in good spirits, perhaps tired from her early start, but otherwise perfectly fine. At 8:23 p.m., Claudia sent her last text message. At 9:12 p.m., she received a text message. Police later confirmed she received this message, but there's no evidence she replied to it. This was the last electronic communication with Claudia Lawrence's phone. After that, silence. What happened in those next hours, between roughly 9 p.m. on Wednesday evening and 6 a.m.? Thursday morning is the central mystery of this case. Did Claudia go to bed as she'd told her mother she would? The evidence suggests she might have. When police eventually entered her house, they found that her bed appeared to have been slept in or at least disturbed. The covers were pulled back, not neatly made. Did she wake up Thursday morning, March 19th, as planned? Again, the evidence suggests yes. Police found breakfast dishes in the sink. A bowl, a spoon, suggesting she'd eaten something before leaving for work. The sink showed she'd washed up after herself. Here's what we know for certain was missing from her house: her mobile phone, her rucksack containing her chef's whites, and curiously, her hair straighteners. Everything else was there: her purse, her passport, her bank cards, money, her car keys, though her car was still in the garage anyway. All the things you'd need if you were voluntarily leaving for an extended period were left behind. This strongly suggested that Claudia had prepared to go to work that morning. She'd eaten breakfast, packed her bag with her work uniform, took her phone, and even took her hair straighteners, perhaps planning to freshen up her appearance at work or after her shift. The route to work from her house took her through residential streets. The most direct path would have taken her along Haworth Road, then onto other roads leading toward the university. There was a CCTV camera at the Melrose Gate post office that would have captured her if she'd walked past it. Police reviewed that footage from the morning of March 19th. Claudia didn't appear on that camera. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister. There were parallel streets she could have taken. The camera might have missed her if she walked on the far side of the road. She might have been given a lift by someone and never walked past the camera at all. But it's notable because it means we don't have visual confirmation of Claudia leaving her house that morning. At 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 19th, Claudia's manager at the university tried calling her mobile phone. By then, she was 4 hours late for her 6 a.m. shift, which was completely unlike her. Claudia was reliable, responsible. If she was going to be late or miss work, she would have called. The phone connected to a cell tower. The call went through, but no one answered. Claudia's manager left a message asking where she was and expressing concern. This call placed Claudia's phone somewhere within a 9-mile radius centered on Tockwith Village, northwest of York. But whether the phone was with Claudia or had already been separated from her, we don't know. At 12:10 p.m., just after noon, something significant happened. Cell phone data analysis later revealed that Claudia's phone was deliberately switched off at that time. Not powered down naturally because the battery died, deliberately turned off. Someone pressed the button and powered it down. The phone's last known location, based on cell tower triangulation, was within an 8-mile radius of York, somewhere in the wider York area. After 12:10 p.m., the phone went dark. It never came back online. It was never found. Claudia's manager, concerned but perhaps thinking Claudia had just overslept or had some minor emergency, didn't immediately escalate the situation. She tried calling a few more times throughout the day but took no further action. She assumed Claudia would show up or call eventually. But Claudia had plans that evening too. She was supposed to meet her friend Susie Cooper at the Nag's Head Pub, a local establishment very close to Claudia's house. Susie and another mutual friend had arranged to meet Claudia for drinks that evening. When Claudia didn't show up, Susie initially wasn't too worried. Maybe Claudia had forgotten. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she'd gotten caught up with something else. Susie sent Claudia a joking text message. "Thanks for standing me up." She was trying to be lighthearted, perhaps mildly annoyed but not alarmed. No response. The next morning, Friday, March 20th, Susie tried calling Claudia again. Still no response. Now she was starting to worry. This wasn't like Claudia. Even if she'd had to miss their plans, she would have responded by now. Susie called Claudia's father, Peter Lawrence. She expressed her concern that she hadn't been able to reach Claudia for 2 days. Peter immediately called the university to check if Claudia had been at work. They told him she hadn't shown up for her shift on Thursday or Friday. 2 days, 2 missed work shifts, no contact with anyone. For someone as reliable as Claudia, this was a 5-alarm fire. At approximately 2 p.m. on Friday, March 20th, 2009, Peter Lawrence reported his daughter missing to North Yorkshire Police. When police arrived at 29 Haworth Road, they found exactly what I've described. A house that looked lived in and normal, with breakfast dishes in the sink, a bed that appeared slept in, and most of Claudia's possessions still in place. Only her phone, work bag, and hair straighteners were missing. At first, police treated this as a routine missing person case. Claudia was 35 years old, an adult, not considered vulnerable. Adults have the right to disappear if they choose. Maybe she'd had a personal crisis. Maybe she'd decided to take off for a few days without telling anyone. Police see cases like this all the time, and usually the person turns up within a few days with an explanation. But as the hours turned into days, and as police learned more about Claudia's character and habits, their concern grew. This wasn't someone who would just vanish without a word. This wasn't someone who'd leave her parents worried sick. This was someone responsible, someone close to her family, someone who showed up for work and kept her commitments. By late March, police had upgraded the case. This wasn't just a missing person anymore. This was now being treated as a suspected murder investigation. They didn't have a body, they didn't have direct evidence of a crime, but everything about Claudia's disappearance suggested something terrible had happened to her. The investigation was given a name, Operation Essence, and it would grow to become one of the largest and most complex missing person investigations North Yorkshire Police had ever conducted. Over the following weeks, months, and years, police would interview over 2,500 people, take over 1,200 witness statements, conduct extensive searches of York and surrounding areas, review thousands of hours of CCTV footage, analyze cell phone data and triangulation, search lakes, woodlands, gravel pits, and rural areas, excavate locations based on tips, bring in national experts and specialists, work with forensic teams using cutting-edge technology. Early in the investigation, police made several public appeals. On June 6, 2009, almost 3 months after Claudia disappeared, BBC's Crime Watch featured a reconstruction of Claudia's last known movements. Actors retraced her steps, recreated her walk home from work, showed viewers what she might have looked like on that last day. The program generated massive public interest. Tips flooded in, but none led to Claudia. Peter Lawrence, Claudia's father, became the public face of the family's anguish. In June 2009, he launched a YouTube video appeal, speaking directly to the camera, begging anyone with information to come forward. The pain in his voice was palpable. Here was a father desperate to know what happened to his daughter, willing to do anything, say anything, reach anyone who might help. Joan Lawrence, Claudia's mother, was equally devastated but more private in her grief. Both parents held on to hope while simultaneously preparing themselves for the worst possible news. As the investigation progressed, police began developing theories and focusing on certain areas and individuals. They looked at several possibilities. Theory 1. Claudia had left voluntarily. Police explored whether Claudia might have had reasons to disappear of her own accord. They knew she'd visited Cyprus 5 times in recent years and had made friends there. Some reports suggested she'd been exploring job opportunities on the island. Had she perhaps decided to start over somewhere new? But this theory quickly fell apart. Claudia's passport was still in her house. She had no money with her except whatever might have been in her work bag. She hadn't touched her bank accounts. Most importantly, her family and friends were adamant that this would be completely out of character. Claudia wouldn't have put them through this agony deliberately.